Welcome to In the Soviet Archives, proudly supported by the Wheeler Center. We respectfully acknowledge that today we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, in particular the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people. We pay respect to their elders and to the elders of all communities and cultures across Victoria. I'm Paula Michaels, a lecturer in modern history at Monash University, and it is my honor tonight to facilitate a conversation with our distinguished guest, Dr. Sheila Fitzpatrick. Hers is a story of a local girl who makes good. Sheila was educated at the University of Melbourne and Oxford, then built a career as a historian in the United States. She's a past president of the U.S. National Slavic Studies Association, winner in 2002 of an Andrew Mellon Foundation Award for Distinguished Achievement in the Humanities, elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and honorary fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. In 2012, she received the American Historical Association's Award for Scholarly Distinction and was winner of the Australian Historical Association's Margery Medal for the first volume of her memoirs, My Father's Daughter, for sale in the lobby, in case you're interested. She is Distinguished Service Professor Emerita at the University of Chicago and Honorary Professor at the University of Sydney. It is no overstatement to say that Sheila has done more than any other single scholar to define the field of Soviet history over the last 40 years. Her work has set the agenda as she led the way in asking new questions and seeking to answer them in new ways. Even those who disagreed with her interpretations, sometimes quite vehemently, had to respond to the challenge her work posed to reigning notions about how the Soviet Union functioned administratively, politically, socially, and economically. Sheila was an early purveyor of history from below, challenging the reigning totalitarian school. Sheila shined a light on the fact that there were both winners and losers in the Soviet system, helping to explain the popular bases for support and offering a much more convincing explanation of its stability than just coercion alone. At a time when historians and political scientists saw the denunciation of the Soviet system as a prime objective of their work, Sheila's research was a frontal attack. As she writes in her new book, she was, quote, fascinated in a non-admiring way by the Soviet Union. But in the heat of the Cold War, her balanced and judicious view of the past sent much of the scholarly establishment into a collective apoplectic fit. A Spy in the Archive is Sheila's memoir of her time working on her doctoral thesis at Oxford and conducting research in the USSR. It was the mid-late 1960s, a time when wisps of reform still hung in the Soviet air before the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia announced that the greater openness of the thaw was well and truly dead. It was a fascinating transitional time witnessed by few Westerners and chronicled with great elegance and an authentic authorial voice in this memoir. The topic of Sheila's thesis was the work of Anton Lunacharsky, the first Soviet Commissariat of Enlightenment, more or less the equivalent to the Minister for Education. I first encountered her study of Lunacharsky when I was working on my undergraduate honors thesis in the mid-1980s. Her 1970 book, The Commissariat of Enlightenment, Soviet Organization of Education and the Arts under Lunacharsky, 1917 to 1921, the published version of her doctoral study, was critical to my own first tentative steps toward a deeper understanding of early Soviet history. I read it in the era of Hollywood's Red Dawn, about teenagers defending their town against a Soviet land invasion, and Rocky IV, which saw Sylvester Stallone take on Ivan Drago, the superhuman Soviet boxing machine. And Ronald Reagan was in the White House denouncing the USSR as the evil empire and saber-rattling with the Strategic Defense Initiative and the deployment of Pershing II missiles to West Germany. But a tiny inner voice of skepticism told me that it couldn't be as black and white as the stories I was hearing. The curiosity for a more multidimensional understanding of this evil empire and its animating forces led me to the study of Soviet history and to Sheila's work, which showed me what scholarship that went beyond the poles of apologia and condemnation looks like. Given the centrality of her work to my own understanding of Soviet history, it was with great interest that I read the memoir of her life as this work on Lunacharsky came into being, And of course, the fact that she's a total rock star, albeit in a certain relatively obscure circle, helped to make it a real page-turner. But A Spy in the Archive is a memoir with much broader appeal, more than just a little inside dish on a bunch of forgotten scholars of the 1960s. The story of a bygone Soviet world makes for fascinating reading. Sheila offers an insider's view of life in the USSR. I caught only the tail end of Soviet history as an eyewitness, but I saw enough to know that she really nails it here. Simple, everyday routines like riding the tram are captured to a T, as is life in the Soviet dormitory. But perhaps most especially, Sheila offers readers a window into what friendship was like in the USSR, the complex, genuine, and sometimes fraught friendships between Soviets and Westerners. Sheila recreates this lost world by bringing all her skills as a historian to bear in her remarkably frank reconstruction of her own life. Perhaps the most impressive and unique attribute of A Spy in the Archive is the way the memoirist turns as historian to the examination of her personal and professional history. No banal navel-gazing going on here. Sheila brings rigor to her story, measuring her memories of events up against the documentary evidence from her diaries and letters home to her mom in Melbourne. We have in this memoir something special, the historian at the top of her game, using all the tools of her trade, research, analysis, writing, to excavate the story of her own interesting life and times. And it is my great pleasure tonight to have the opportunity to probe that story with her further. I'll get the conversation going with a few questions of my own, and then I'll open it up to the floor for your questions. Good evening, Sheila. So, Sheila, I thought we could start where the book starts. You were denounced in a Soviet newspaper as a spy, and I think that you might be the only one in this room who has that claim to fame. And I thought, could you tell our audience a little bit about that episode? You know, from today's perspective, it's a kind of a music anecdote, but at the time, it must have been a little bit upsetting.
Oh, it was upsetting. I have to say, though, it wasn't fully a spy. It was the next thing to a spy. That's what they said. They said I was, and it was in a daily newspaper. Which is incredible. I mean, here we wouldn't have have almost a whole page of a daily newspaper devoted to denouncing some scholarly work as the next thing to sort of hostile espionage. It was published when I was in the Soviet Union, but I didn't see it because it was in a horrible newspaper, a sort of nationalist newspaper that none of my friends read, or and I didn't know. If my friends had read it, they wouldn't have known who it was about because it refers to me. It was talking about Sheila Fitzpatrick, who was the author of the article that was being criticized. Now, in the Soviet Union, I was not known as Fitzpatrick, but Bruce, which was my married name. Therefore, my friends wouldn't have recognized it, and the author of the attack thought I was a man. In other words, the KGB really sort of slipped up. Because they didn't realize that this woman, this young woman who was there on the exchange was the same person as this really sinister anti-Soviet person who was publishing, their anti-Soviet articles, which were the next thing to spying.
So no wonder they lost the Cold War if they couldn't even put that together, right?
Yeah.
So your friendship with Igor Sats is really the centerpiece of this book in many ways, and is central to this period of your life. It seems like you met him at a critical moment, both intellectually and personally. Sats influenced your view of the USSR, too many S's in that, USSR, and he also came into your life on the heels of your father, Brian Fitzpatrick's death. Can you tell us a little bit about who Igor was and what kind of imprint you think he left on you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that Igor comes across as the center of the book because, in a way, the book is in part my celebration of him because he was a wonderful thing in my life and completely, in a sense, unexpected. He was an old Bolshevik. That is, he'd been a Bolshevik. He'd run away from a middle-class Jewish family in Kiev to fight for the revolution at the age of about 14, giving up his study. He's been going to be a pianist. But he got sort of shot up in the war, and he couldn't play anymore. So that was that. And he was really badly wounded, actually, in the Civil War. That is at the beginning of the 20s. Took him several years to recover. When he did, he got himself to Moscow. Actually, it was his former professor of piano that got him there. And there he found that his sister had married who but Lunacharsky, which was itself actually a rather scandalous thing, because it was a second marriage, and the first wife was an old revolutionary. But anyway, so the Lunacharsky took in Igor, and they nursed him back to health, basically, and he became his literary secretary, his main assistant. So. For me, he was a most incredible source of information on my dissertation. But that wasn't all that one could say about Igor, because in his current incarnation, when I met him in the 60s, he was one of the editors of a journal which was the nearest thing to a kind of loyal opposition journal in the Soviet Union. Everybody read this journal. It was called Novy Mir, New World. Everybody read it. And when it came out, people would fight over copies and so on. So it was really a wonderfully central place for the cultural life. And when Igor sort of adopted me, I think he thought when I turned up on his doorstep, he thought I was a kind of stray, a waif or a stray. And he always collected those people. He was very kind to everybody who wasn't important. If a person was important, he got a bit bolshy, and he'd be rude to them. But somebody who wasn't important, who was a bit lost and adrift, somebody who was wearing a coat that wasn't warm enough for the Moscow winter, which was a big, one of his first comments. So he sort of took me in and encouraged me to come round often to talk about Lunacharsky. But I noticed we were not talking about Lunacharsky all the time, because we were talking about his journal a lot of the time. And the journal was under tremendous pressure all the time. They were the first publishers of Solzhenitsyn in the Soviet Union. And they would say, we want to publish some more Solzhenitsyn, and then the censor would say no, and they'd appeal to the Central Committee, and there was tremendous drama about getting this journal out. So, for me, this is absolutely incredible. It was a sort of triple thing. First of all, he knows everything about Lunacharsky. Secondly, he's telling me all about the thing that's most exciting in the Soviet Union culturally, which is Novy Mir. And thirdly, he's adopted me. So
What's not to like?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Another figure that looms large is Irina, who also is connected to Lunacharsky. You seem to have a bit more of she has a kind of push-pull influence on you, that there are things you clearly like and respect about her, but maybe she's a bit of a bulldozer, kind of overwhelming at times. And so I wonder, she seems to me, I felt like I had met people like this in the Soviet Union. She seemed very familiar. On the one hand, she's someone of privilege. On the other hand, she has to really work at sustaining her privilege and learn how to use the system. That she is also kind of high maintenance, I would say. And I wonder if you could say something about her and kind of that sort of type of person that the Soviet system seemed to produce?
Well, I think it probably did, although I never knew anybody who was quite as much of an Arena as Irina was. She was tremendous. She was an absolute bulldozer. She was a sort of force of nature, very beautiful, elegant, in a way that nobody was in the Soviet Union. Living in this 8-room apartment with 18th century furniture. I mean, I was completely bowled over when I first went there. She was a journalist, a science journalist by profession, but what she devoted herself to was maintaining and advancing the reputation of her father, her adoptive father, actually, but she thought of him as her father.
Who was Lunacharsky?
Who was Lunacharsky, yes. And she, she came on tremendously strong. She was absolutely insistent that you accept whatever she said. And in a way, when she talked unlike Igor, who was full of sort of black humor and jokes about the Soviet system, Irina didn't really, she was much more cautious, and she wanted to make sure that what I wrote was the right kind of thing. She wanted really to censor my work in a way that Igor never did. But you could, while this was in a way very annoying and I had to take evasive action, you could understand it. But if you thought about her own life, she starts off privileged. Well, actually, she starts off non-privileged because her mother, her mother gave birth to her in the Civil War with her father dead and not quite clear which side he was fighting on. And, so the mother's situation was not great when she was born in 1918. But then the mother fell on her feet, hooked Lunacharsky, and he adopted Irina. And so she lived a very privileged life, sort of mixing, she knew everybody, she knew Stalin, she knew Bukhar, and she knew, you name it, she'd met them as a child. And then the father dies. That was in 1933. And he was already not in completely good repute when he died, but after he died, many of the privileges were taken away. Then comes 1937. And 1937 is the year of the Great Purge, and when very many of the leaders of the party and government and old Bolsheviks, in other words, the social circle, the privileged social circle she'd grown up with, they start to be arrested en masse. And Irina had this story, which I tell in the book, about she's going to university at 18 or maybe just turning 19. And at that time, when you entered university, you had to write down, do you know any enemies of the people? In other words, any of these newly discovered traitors who'd been arrested. And Irina knew dozens of them. So according to her, she starts writing them all down, one after the other. And she finishes that page and she goes on to another page. And then comes in one of her remaining highly placed protectors and takes the thing away from her and throws it away and says, you don't know any enemies of the people. And that's that. But, so life was not very straightforward for her. Mm-hmm. I mean, even though she came from such a privileged situation, at the crucial moment of when she's entering adulthood, she sees she's going to have to fight for survival, basically. Mm-hmm. Now, her mother and nobody, well, that's not true. Her mother was not arrested. Her mother might easily have been arrested, but by chance wasn't. Her aunt and her aunt's husband and the husband of another aunt, they were all arrested. So, not the very tense beginnings for her life.
Right. Tell us a little bit about the method for writing the book, because I was very much struck by your craftsmanship as a historian, turning that onto the examination of your own life. It's not just you reminiscing about the good old days. You're actually juggling these various sources, your mother's letters, your diaries. You're actually reading the memoirs of other people of this time as well, and putting that up against what you know about Igor, for example. Mm-hmm. And so could you talk about how, sort of the method of your work with
Well, I have to say, I wrote this book very quickly. I started writing it, if I remember, on November 1st. I moved back to Sydney from America in July. And I had a contract with MUP to deliver this book in March, I think, end of March of this year. And somehow, one way and another, I didn't start writing till November 1st. And then I really wrote. I wrote very quickly. But however, it is true what you say, that I did it also like a historian, because I had such wonderful sources. I had all my letters to my mother and all my mother's letters to me, and I wrote on a weekly basis. So that was terrific. I had a diary that I carried around with me the whole year, so the KGB wouldn't go into my room and get it. It was just the first year. I didn't keep the diary later. Now, but I didn't use other people's memoirs. Although actually Robert Dessay, you know, in a chapter in A Mother's Disgrace, he was there at the same time, and he's got a great chapter there. But I didn't read that when I was writing it. There's just one chapter which is about Igor's journal, and that's where I read the other memoirs, because I realized, and this was a real eye opener to me. Igor, after a few months, he was telling me virtually on a daily basis everything that happened to the journal, and it was this sort of, you know, David and Goliath story. It was all full of drama again, with the fighting the regime and the censorship and so on. Now, what I became aware of when I read the diaries that have since been published of other editors of Novi Mir is that practically all the editors were either telling their story to somebody who wrote it down, like me, like I was doing, or they were writing their own diary. And all of our accounts are very similar. They all have the same sort of emotional story of us fighting for the truth against the forces of darkness and repression and reaction. So I got fascinated by the notion of everybody running away and writing down the same account. And I even started to think, well, what about the people who were the enemies of Novi Mir? Where did they write their story? And I was quite interested in them, in that my official advisor in Moscow was such a person. Actually, when Igor finally got kicked off the journal, it was actually my official advisor. They hated each other, who was appointed. But he didn't keep diaries, or if he did, they haven't been published.
They mustn't have been nearly as interesting as the good guys in the story's diaries.
Well, but I mean, the bad guys have to have a story too. In general, they're allowed to have it. But anyway, in this case, the bad guys didn't have a story. Yes. They didn't.
Not to make it too black and white, the good guys and the bad guys. The other source you have is the ways that you've retold stories over time that have kind of frozen them in a certain way, and then putting those up against your letters home, which tell those stories differently. That I found interesting, because I'm not a regular diary keeper myself, but I did keep a diary in the first months after my son was born. And I went back like 10 years later and looked at it, and I realized I had a completely distorted memory of that period. And, what was that like to see things that you thought you knew, that you actively remembered one way, and it turned out not to be as you thought it was? Yeah.
Well, I'd been down that road before, because with my father's daughter, I had very strong feelings that I had the stories about my growing up. I had the stories about my father, and I did the same thing, that I consulted letters and so on. And I found in many cases they had quite strikingly departed from what appeared to be the factual truth, even though they had a sort of emotional truth, you might say. Now, so I found I wasn't surprised with The Spy in the Archives that this happened. I think it happened a little bit less, in that perhaps I made fewer myths about the Moscow period than I did about my actual childhood. But still, I mean, anybody who thinks that they know about their past and they remember it, I think they did to approach that assumption very warily.
It's also interesting the way we've chosen to remember things, and how that becomes a kind of alternative truth about it. Says something about us as time passes, that we've chosen to remember it in that particular way.
Well, yeah, and I think also you just make it into a good story that makes a point, of course, that
at a dinner party
that you want to make. But I got the feeling, after I've thought about this for a while, that it's almost like bringing up a file on a computer, and you edit it every time you tell the story, and then you save it in the new version. I start to doubt that there's a true memory deep down, buried. I just thought it's written over. You know, the way if you accidentally write over a file on a computer, you've lost the original. Right. It's just gone.
Yep. So I'm going to ask you one more question, then we can open it up to our audience, which is, Over the years, you've supervised, it's fair to say, a small army of Russian historians at the University of Chicago. And we were talking previously, and I don't know it for an absolute fact, but I'm pretty sure that you've probably supervised more PhDs in Soviet history than any other historian in the United States. And yet in the memoir, you have two mentors, a British mentor and a Soviet mentor, at least your official Soviet mentor, who aren't very good mentors. And clearly you must be a good mentor. I've known many of your students, and so I actually have heard it from the horse's mouth that you are a good mentor. And certainly if the proof is in the pudding in their work, then you definitely are. And so what kind of do you think Igor was a model for you about what a good mentor should do for a student? And, what is it that you didn't get from your mentor at Oxford and in Moscow that you wish you had had, and maybe that you brought those desires into your own mentoring relationship with your students?
Well, in Oxford, I was terribly disappointed with Oxford and terribly critical of it because I thought nobody knows anything about Soviet history. It's a new field. And anyway, I was terribly critical, the way one is in one's 20s about things. And the man who I got as a mentor, I really feel for him. He was Max Hayward. He was a wonderful translator. He translated Dr. Zhivago, Pasternak's, and many other. But he wasn't a historian, and he got landed with me, and I kept talking to him about sources and archives, and he would give me this funny look. And later I met him in America, where he's much more relaxed than he was in Oxford, and he said he absolutely hated these meetings with me because he didn't know what it was that I wanted. He didn't know what these sources and archives were that I was talking about. He was trying to give me all the good gossip he'd heard, and mainly from intelligence people, because this was a big sort of spy college in a way. So I was very disappointed with Max, and it was a very unhappy experience for Max too, having me as a student. And there wasn't a community at Oxford of people working on the same kind of thing. So I felt very much on my own, and so then I get to Moscow, and at first I liked my official advisor, if you remember. I really thought, he's going to help me and so on. And then I start to think he's really creepy because, anyway, for various reasons, I start to think he's really creepy, and I went off him.
You have to read the book to find out why he's creepy.
And then I met Igor. And so Igor sort of is so generous a mentor and somebody who understands his duty to be, looking after the whole person, so to speak, seeing that you have that you have enough to eat and you have enough subway tokens and everything like that. And there was a tremendous in Oxford I'd felt that I sink or swim, but nobody's going to notice really. So I'm sure that when I found myself in America suddenly with lots of graduate students, which was the beginning of the 1990s when I moved to the University of Chicago, the first thing I wanted, I didn't think, first of all, I want to be a wonderful mentor to them. I think the first thing I remember thinking was, I have to build up a community here so that they can support each other, so that they can have that kind of support that I didn't have at Oxford. But, of course, then I sort of injected myself into the mix too. But I'm sure that I was not the kind of mentor at Chicago who not only gives advice but wants to know all about the people's boyfriends and girlfriends and so on. I rather, while they were students... Did
you make sure they had enough to eat and had subway tokens?
I probably even that.
Their winter
I
coat
did
was
make sure,
enough.
in the sense, I was always having to help them get fellowships.
That's
so
true.
In that sense.
Right.
But I wasn't the kind of mentor who was terribly buddy-buddy and go out to the pub with them. And not until after they graduated. Then
Right. Yeah. Okay, well, we've got about 25 minutes left, so why don't we open it up? We've got people from the festival coming with microphones. If you can raise your hand and stand up.
It's been said that the Cambridge nest of spies still cast a shadow on relationships between the UK and the US and Russia today. How would you measure a statement like that?
Can you say what cast a shadow?
The people like Kim Philby in the Cambridge nest of spies.
Ah, yes. Well, I wonder. Yes, I suppose that must be right. I mean, the whole Litvinenko thing was obviously sort of stirring up, sort of suppressed memories. When I was there in June, and when I had a strange experience apropos of the Cambridge group that in the series Lives of Remarkable Men, you probably know it. It's a popular series of biographies. There is the biography of Kim Philby by a Russian, and it's all based on a Russian who comes out of the KGB, evidently, and it's all based on how Philby fitted into that KGB community, which was not very happily initially. And how he dealt with his handlers, and the prime informant is the Russian woman who became, I mean, presumably sent by the KGB initially, but who became a devoted partner to him. So in a sense, I mean, this is not really exactly answering that question, but I became aware not only in terms of the shadow, but in terms of these odd kind of memories that lie around there.
Other questions? There's.
Hi, thanks very much for a lovely talk. I was just wondering, for those of us not having any kind of experience with a country in the Soviet bloc, it seems within the 20th century to take a very, very long time to understand just how horrible it could be within Russia. And I think particularly about Robert Conquest's book, The Great Terror, which very much later on he wrote a second edition of. And I think with great apologies for my language, Kingsley Amis suggested the subtitle of the reassessment should be, I told you so, you fucking fools. Why do you think it took so very, very long for the rest of us outside the Soviet Union to understand just how horrible things could be there?
Well, I don't really know, because the information was out rather effectively, as it seemed to me, from the 60s and certainly from the 70s. I mean, here people's memories are odd, because I read the book by Anne Applebaum on Gulag, and she says in the beginning, I discovered this subject, nobody knew about Gulag. Well, in 1973 or 4 or whatever it was, Solzhenitsyn published the Gulag Archipelago, and the important things about Gulag are all in there, and it was an international bestseller. So I don't, I feel as if people had the ability to know, and perhaps they knew and they've forgotten they knew, or something like that.
Other questions?
Hello. I'm interested in your idea of factual truth versus emotional truth in terms of when you were talking about memoir, and how you think that those notions of truth work when you're actually in the archive and trying to interpret the documents that you're looking at and so on, and the diaries and so forth.
Well, in the archives, I was working. This is me there in the late 60s. I with great difficulty I got into the archives, and I was working on what were essentially institutional records, the records of the ministry, in effect, that my man Lunacharsky headed. Now, my notion of myself as a historian at that point, or my notion of what a historian had to do, was to try with all their might to be objective. You knew that you wouldn't be, but you believed that the quest for objectivity was the key thing. Actually, it was Melbourne University that taught me that. So that was now we see things a bit differently, and that includes me. But at that time, I thought of myself as a person who has to go out and get just as much data, especially archival data, as I can, and then I've got to approach it with an absolutely sort of open mind and go where it leads me, which, in practice, perhaps nobody ever does. But I think my mind, I think looking back, actually, that my mind was, in a sense, relatively open, in that I knew so little about how governments work. When I went into the archives, I was, 25 years old. I'd never worked in government. I had simply no real-world experience of that. I had no real-world experience of any bureaucracy. And if you work with bureaucratic archives, I mean, it's all about bureaucracy. It's about how they fight each other and how they try and expand their jurisdiction, their empire builders, and so on. So I read all this with astonishment and kind of took it in as best I could. But I think I had much more of a positive attitude there that. Rather like the Novi Mir, the one the journal had about, there's truth and there are the suppressors of truth. I think I felt then that I can get to the archives and I can get through the veneer of the lies that are told in both sides. The Soviets tell lies, and on the American side, on the Cold War side, there's a certain amount of lying too. And I thought with the archives I can get through that.
Back there.
Hi, I was wondering what you were expecting when you went to Russia, both at a sort of a personal daily life and to access the information, and how that compared with reality when you actually got there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wish I could remember exactly what I was expecting. Now, I had been, I didn't manage to get myself on the official exchange until the autumn of '66, but the year before, or 6 months before, I had gone on a 2-week trip as a tourist, so I'd sort of seen a little bit. I didn't come at it totally cold. What I remember is the things that struck me when I got there. And I was struck extremely strongly by the discomfort of living there and the inconvenience of the way everything was arranged. I just couldn't believe that a society could be so uncomfortable and inconvenient and at the same time, and backward, I mean, not have things that you would expect they should have. I was very struck by the fact they didn't seem to have discovered plastics, although that's not true. They had discovered plastics, they just hadn't put any money into them. But so that it could be so backward, and that the people in this society should tell you with such evident pride that they were so progressive, they were so advanced in every respect. There was a phrase that we students always used to quote. They would say, "We have everything, всё у нас есть." We've got everything. Everything that's in the West we've got, and probably we've got it bigger. And often this was such a self-delusion that you couldn't but be struck by that.
Back there.
Challenging your optimistic view of our press and how you were speaking of the article in Novi Mir and you were surprised that I remember the book Spycatcher being published here, being front page news and grand legal debates on either side of the world, from England where it couldn't be published and the man in Australia in fear of his life for publishing it. It was about 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, I remember that. And of course that, I mean, despite having been accused of being next thing to a spy, I actually wasn't a spy for anybody. And I did my very best to keep away from spies. But because the college I was at in Oxford was full of former spies, people, really sort of pensioned off people from British intelligence. So I couldn't help knowing a lot of those people, although I really tried to avoid knowing them, but couldn't help it. And in the Soviet case, there were well-known people who were not just who were KGB, but who were important KGB. You know, KGB comes in many gradations, but who were important KGB who dealt with the Westerners. And they would try to make your acquaintance because that was part of their job description. And I was extremely energetic in avoiding those people. So although I had some tangential connection with the world of espionage, I did try to keep my distance.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could touch on some of the nostalgia that people in the post-Soviet countries are feeling now, obviously kind of more older generations, and if you could reflect on some of the genuinely positive things that were a part of the daily life in the Soviet Union.
Well, I think it's not fully only the older generation, though mainly, of course. Yes, well, I'm not sure that I'd put it... I mean, it's not so much that in their nostalgia, I recognized things that I thought were good at the time. Because the things I thought were good at the time about that society were sort of odd things, like the fact that it being somewhat repressive but not terribly repressive, the friendship groups were so warm and supportive. I mean, this is not a thing that anybody ever claims for it, but that was probably one of the best things I thought about that society as practically experienced. But I think a lot of the nostalgia now is related to the fact that in the Soviet period in particular, and under Stalin in particular, you know, the Soviet Union mattered in the world. It was one of the two great powers. They were the victors in World War II. There was a feeling of pride, and people did have this, even when they were critical, a feeling of pride in national achievement. Well, all of that vanished with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, Putin, of course, would like to rebuild it, but it's hard because, in fact, it has slipped. It's not, you know, it's a sort of middle level power now. And so I think they say all sorts of things in the nostalgia. They say, well, there was order on the streets. They say things didn't cost so much and so on. And almost all of those you can produce arguments showing that, you know, undermining that argument. But I think the feeling we mattered in the world then and people respected us, they use that term respect a lot, and now they don't. I think that's the core of it.
There's a question down here.
Whilst I look forward to reading your book, could you just fill in the beginning part of how you actually chose your area of research and how at that particular time that the book's set it was perceived at Oxford and in the Soviet Union and possibly by other key groups?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, how I chose it, for that one I have to refer you to My Father's Daughter, the first memoir, because in that, at least a lot of that choice comes out of the fact that I grew up the daughter of a Melbourne radical, Brian Fitzpatrick, who, like many people on the left, didn't know much about the Soviet Union, but hoped that things were okay, hoped that they were building a better society over there. So I, as a teenager, I start to challenge my father and would argue with him, including about the Soviet Union, which I thought he didn't really know very much about, and I was inclined to think it probably wasn't a great place. So that argument was a part of why I ended up in Soviet studies. Another part of it was that the Russian department of the university, at the time I went to the university, was under heavy criticism in the wake of the Petrov case, because anybody who teaches Russian, maybe they teach it, you know, for spying purposes or whatever. So left-wing parents like mine who had a child going to the university doing arts were likely to encourage them to go and take Russian, you know, to support the Russian department. Nina Christensen, the head of it, was a friend of my parents. So I did that, but I was a history student, and then I come to write my history fourth-year essay, which is a big thing in the old Melbourne program, the honours program. And so I thought, well, I'll try and use my Russian. I'll write. I was actually on Soviet music, and that's when I got hooked. I mean, that's what made me a historian. I was fascinated by the process of doing that research. And so then, you know, the next thing was they sent you off to Oxford or Cambridge or whatever to get a PhD, and you have to say that you're a specialist in something or you're planning to do something. So I wrote down Russian history, and that was that.
And why Lunacharsky? Why Lunacharsky?
Oh, well, Lunacharsky, you know, or in Oxford, Max and my advisor and everybody, they were focused very much on the sort of critics, the outright critics of the system, the martyrs, basically, the people who didn't compromise, who actually the people rather, people that one could, in which category one could put my father in an Australian context. Now, I'm kind of critical of my father at the time I'm choosing this topic. And so I think that outright opposition, maybe, you know, putting yourself against the government all the time, maybe, you know, that's not the only choice. So I actually wanted, there's a letter to my father before he died, saying, I want to work on one of the compromises. I don't want to work on the heroic ones, but one of the compromises and see what's involved in that those compromises. And Lunacharsky, he was the man, he was an intellectual, but he was also a Bolshevik. And so he called himself a Bolshevik among intellectuals, an intellectual among Bolsheviks. So he was trying to build bridges and so on. So he's a classic sort of person who makes compromises.
Amongst the sort of culture of forgetting that has gone on with the Soviet Union, it's interesting to hear about particularly the Gulag Archipelago, like massive book during the Cold War sort of vanishing from people's memory. Amongst the sort of detritus of the post-Cold War era, there's this incredibly rich literature and drama, in particular from the Soviet era. And I'm thinking about writers like Isaac Babel and Yevgeny Schwartz, who, and Abuzov, who made incredible contributions to world literature. And I'm trying to work out, how do we preserve great works of literature and retain, the praise of their content and their form in a world that's forgetting what the context of that production is? Like, can we save great artworks from that period if we've forgotten how the Soviet Union was?
Well, that's a very interesting point, yes. I feel about Isaac Babel that, maybe he can survive lack of context. I mean, there's such an emotional vividness to those short stories, but it gets more interesting and complicated if you think of something like a panoramic novel like Dr. Zhivago, which in a way depends on people thinking that the revolution matters, because it's about what the revolution does to the intelligentsia. And I don't know how that reads if one's lost the sense of context. There's also another category of literature. By the way, I think that Solzhenitsyn, what I think of his greatest literary works, like Gulag and some of the polemics, like Lenin in Zurich, I think those also have survived. But a whole genre of sort of not the greatest literature, but quite good literature, which was the kind of thing that Novi Mir published, which were things in the form of fiction, but actually realistic social presentations of slices of social life, life on the collective farm or whatever. I think those probably are ones that, you'd read them now and they've just lost what they had when you read them within that context.
Were there any big surprises in the archives? Did you find smoking guns that you weren't looking for?
Everything was a surprise, as I said. I was totally... At that point, there was a sense that... because we didn't have sources, really. We had Pravda and we had Stalin's work. So there was a sense that everything that happened in the Soviet Union was dictated from on high, and nothing happened anywhere further down. So I'm working in archives which are they're not grassroots, not at all. They're ministerial level, but still they're one level down. And I could see, the first sort of shock was to see all kinds of initiatives happening there, all kinds of sort of things that came down from them from above. They're circumventing or they're changing in some way. So all of that was a big surprise. Now, they didn't like giving out archives. They wouldn't let me into the Communist Party archives, though I really pleaded with them. But they finally said, "Well, are you a member of the Communist Party?" So I said no, and they said, "Well, these are archives for our members, so you can't come there." But that's where the secrets were.
Did you consider joining just to get into the archive?
No. If you were the daughter of a radical in the Cold War, you wouldn't consider joining the Communist Party for an instrumental purpose. No, I would have been too. And so they wouldn't let us into the places where the secrets were, but the political secrets. On the other hand, I suppose the sort of expose file that I found, this was really quite odd. This was, it would be the early 70s, I think, when I was mid-70s maybe. Anyway, it was after that first period in the Soviet Union. So just to say something about the archives, they wouldn't give you an inventory of what they had. There were no catalogues. You had to ask for the kind of material they might have, and they would bring them. So I was at one point, it was post-Lunacharsky, I was asking for something on labor policy, and I got a bunch of stuff, and in that was a file that you opened it and it said labor recruitment, 1932 to 33 or whatever. Seemed very innocuous. I opened it and I saw it's about convict labor. It's all about trying to get labor from the predecessor of the KGB for various industrial projects. And I couldn't believe they'd given it to me, because this was the kind of thing they were trying to hide. And anyway, I took notes on it and I gave it back, and then I said, can I have more in that series? And they said there are no more in that series. But then much later would be in Perestroika, I guess the beginning of the 90s, I met one of the senior archivists who'd been apparently responsible for selecting material. And she said to me, did you like that file I sent you? So funny things went on behind the scenes, even when we didn't actually know they were going on.
A little present from the archivist. Other question? Yes.
Yeah, well, just wonder if you can give us a bit of an idea in terms of how you see the American attitude towards Russia at the moment. It seems like they're lining each other up a bit over Syria and some of the other issues in the Middle East. And we've been through, a fairly nasty time with the Cold War, and both the countries have nuclear weapons and fairly well armed. How do you see the evolving crisis happening in the Middle East with Syria and stuff? And certainly Putin and Obama don't seem to be in love with each other.
Right. There's no love lost, that's obvious. On the other hand, I would see both sides as trying to keep the relationship sort of functioning. Obama did cancel that meeting because of Snowden, but nevertheless, he's going to see him at Putin at another meeting. When you're in Russia, which is changing your question around a bit, but in June when I was there and I was reading the papers, I was struck by the hostility in the newspapers to America, the way they were treating it still in Cold War terms, more than Putin does, I think. In other words, I start to get the feeling that there's a public opinion that's more anti-American than Putin and his people are. In America, my sense of it, the Cold War in America, it was a very funny thing. It was so strong, and then suddenly, almost overnight, it seemed to sort of, a large part of it just disappeared. But of course, leaving a residue. I think in America, most people truly don't think that Russia matters that much anymore. And therefore, if it doesn't matter, there are limits to how angry you have to get with them. And on the Syria, I don't know how they're going to handle that. But I in what is actually a rather ignorant way, I don't feel as if it's going to produce disaster on the American-Russian relations side.
Do you have thoughts about how the West should respond to the anti-gay legislation in Russia?
That's another thing that's really astonishing. This is a crazy. Again, there's legislation, but it's terribly popular legislation, and the newspapers and people you talk to, they say absolutely wild things about gays. Like, remember the Bolsheviks were a small minority that a sort of a network, and they took power. Well, the gays are like that. They say things like that, which is completely wild. And then I remember reading some articles about how the decline of France was absolutely definitively shown by the fact that that France had allowed same-sex marriage, and Russia had to fight to the death to stop this degeneration sort of wearing away at their fabric too. But I don't think. If you have a popular opinion like that, and people abroad criticize it, they know about the criticism abroad, but I think they just think that it's a sign of the terrible degeneration in the West that there is all this criticism. I think this is a case where probably the Putin regime people are a bit more sophisticated.
She's coming.
If I return to
Just a
Moscow,
second.
I wonder if I could go into the Lenin Library and actually see if there's a copy of your book there.
You could.
I'll repeat the question.
Yes,
Sorry
you could quite successfully go in. Just take your passport and go around to the little thing called Bureau of Passports, and they give you. That's all the documentation you need. And now all the books that well, I must admit I didn't look up my actual own books, but they must be there because I looked up other people's. When I was there in June, I was, there were various monographs, American monographs or whatever that I want to look up. And I could find them in the catalogue, including the online catalogue. I think you can you get it out here? But you can. They certainly now have an online catalogue, which you can access there, including all their recent non-Russian language acquisitions. But they used, of course, to keep all those dangerous books in the so-called in a special safe place that you had to be a trusted person to get.
How important do you think is the conservative power of the church in shaping official Russian policy towards gays, pop music, which is pretty topical at the moment with Pussy Riot? How important do you think the church is?
Well, the church is certainly always being cited as or sort of brought in, and its spokesmen, of course, express their opinions. I don't get the feeling that the driving power is I don't get the feeling that the church is the initiator so much as that it's joining this this bandwagon, because all the things that we hate that happen in Russia tend to be quite popular there.
So we're going to have to leave it at that. It's 6 o'clock. So thank you all for your great questions. Thank you, Sheila, for an interesting conversation. I encourage you to buy her books in the lobby, and thank you so much.